welcome back. This is Mark Stump, October 2013. This is one of the basic videos for beginners. I've discussed shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. This is about choosing values, choosing a set of values for a specific shot. So let's say we just got a camera and it's totally manual. My first camera was manual. Required me to set the shutter speed and the aperture manually every single time. There was no auto. Anyway, let's say we're doing that. Only let's say we're doing it with a modern digital cameras. I would start off, if I had my D800 in manual, I would start off at the base ISO, which for my camera is 100. For your camera it might be 80, might be 100, might be 200. But I would start off with that base ISO because that offers me the best image quality. So I'd start off there, and then there's usually no harm in using a shutter speed that's too fast, unless you're sacrificing in other areas for the shutter speed that you don't need. Then there's harm. So, but to begin with, let me say I'm starting off with my base ISO and my fastest shutter speed. Now, when it comes to aperture, I'll want to choose my aperture based on the depth of field that I require or that I desire. So, for instance, in this shot, if you want your subject in focus and you want your background out of focus, then you want a narrow depth of field. And your depth of field will also depend on your distance from the subject. But I would say this is f4 or less. I mean, this picture I know I took at f1.8. You can sometimes get a shallow depth of field at f.4. It depends on the focal length and the distance. But anyway, if you want shallow depth of field, then you pick a small number which corresponds to a large aperture. The reason the small numbers are the large apertures, and I'll talk about this in another video, I'll get into the mathematics of aperture. But for right now, it's the denominator in a fraction. f2 means the focal length divided by 2. So on an aperture, on a 50 millimeter lens, I didn't mean to go into this right now, but on a 50 millimeter lens, an aperture of f2 would be a 25 millimeter aperture. Anyway, on this shot, I used f11, a small hole and a greater depth of field. So we're choosing aperture based on whether we want everything in focus, most everything in focus, or only certain things in focus. So okay, review. Base ISO, start off with a fast shutter speed, choose my aperture. Now your camera will have a light meter. And your light meter will tell you that you're probably underexposed at this point. If you have enough light to use your fastest shutter speed at your base ISO and whatever aperture you want, then you're good. But probably you'll be underexposed at this point. And you'll have to start bringing down your shutter speed. I mean, that's what you should do. You could turn up your ISO, but you'll be sacrificing quality. And in most cases, you will not be sacrificing anything by turning your shutter speed down from its highest, from its fastest setting. So I'd be turning the shutter speed down until one of two things happens. Either I achieve correct exposure, or I get to that point where I'm really worried that I'm going to get blurring because of the slow shutter speed. So, and that depends on what I'm shooting. If somebody's sitting still, I might be willing to shoot at a 30th of a second, probably no slower than that, but between a 60th and a 30th of a second for somebody sitting still. If I'm shooting a soccer game or a dance at a wedding, then I might want, I don't know, a 200th of a second. So I'm turning down the shutter until I get to either correct exposure or until I get to one of those values and I'm afraid to go any lower. So if you get to the point where you don't want to go lower on your shutter speed and you have the aperture you want, then you can turn up your ISO or you can turn on some more lights. You know, use a flash, find some light, open a window, or turn up your ISO. And then only turn up your ISO as much as you need to, because you'll be sacrificing, I've said this before, tonal range, dynamic range, and your signal to noise ratio. So that's it. That's how I would set those values. Those would be my considerations. And that brings us to the end of this video on setting shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Thank you very much.